My name is Scott Webster. It's my pleasure to be chair today. Before we begin, I acknowledge that the University of Sydney is built on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and sovereignty was never ceded. It was forcibly and violently taken, and I pay respects to elders past and present. So in today's seminar, Whitefella Mischief, we'll be hearing a series of exchanges between Dr. Max Brierty and Professor Stephen Muck. Max Brierty is a descendant of the Kalili people. He is a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry at the University of Queensland. In a few months, Max will be heading to the United States to undertake a year-long research fellowship at Harvard University at the Department of Comparative Literature. And Stephen Muck is an adjunct professor at the Mulungu Research Institute, Notre Dame University in Broome, and emeritus professor of ethnography at the University of New South Wales. His translation of Philippe Pignat's La Tour Stenger's An Entangled Flight was just published with Polity. So I'll turn it over to our two speakers.
Thanks, Scott. Hey, Stephen, how are you going?
I'm well. Max, yourself?
Everything's mirror with me. Everything's streaming and good.
Nice. So how should we begin?
At the beginning, I guess.
When was that? Do you mean we're retracing our steps?
No, let's not rehearse things. Let's begin where we left off in Melbourne at the CSAA conference. Whitefella Mischief, a tour of the Museum of the Magicians of Reason, that actually began in the future in the year 2060. At the museum, we dreamt up in an old tin shed on my country, Kalili country, in the southwest corner of Queensland.
So this will all be new stuff?
With some old stuff, like the past in dialogue with the future, the old with the young.
You're right. Keep going. I'll look out for you.
Same as it ever was.
You want to tell them what we mean by mischief?
Well, tricks of appearances and disappearances, sleight of hand, magic, a conjuration, making something appear, or an exorcism or something like it to make things disappear or go away. There's a whole range.
Apotropaic language, spells to keep evil at bay.
Yeah, and what you fellas call reason has its magical tricks as well, a backbone to a lot of magic.
We were first inspired by Deleuze and Guattari's response to Goya.
Yeah, they reminded us that a vigilant and insomniac rationality creates its own monsters. And time must fit in with that as well. After all, there's a whole box of tricks associated with time. The kind of time that was a weapon the invaders brought with them to this continent. The concepts, the technologies, the academic discipline of history.
We can't unpack all that today, too much stuff.
Well, we have a few exhibits here in the museum.
Ah, yes. Each one illustrates a spell and a counterspell. Like Goya put his faith in reason and D&G cast a doubt. They knew that the truths of the European Enlightenment were not piling up one by one and the rest of the world was eternally grateful for them. They knew there were other kinds of rationality in the world, including the non-human or more than human rationalities that made their philosophy so expansive.
Yeah, and here's our first exhibit in the brand new temporality swing, the stages of civilization. This fiction of global time was invented as a justification for imperialism. The Western powers were not just rampaging and pillaging. Oh no, they were bringing civilization to poor, unfortunate peoples who were stuck at earlier stages. But what counterspell did we have for this one, Stephen?
The view from the other side of the frontier. Graeber and Wengrow call it, this is from their Dawn of Everything book, call it indigenous critique, that consistent moral and intellectual assault on European society, widely voiced by Native American observers from the 17th century onwards. They put Kandiaromp's suppressed voice front and center.
Kandiaronk says, I've spent 6 years reflecting on the state of European society, and I still can't think of a single way they act that's not inhuman. And I genuinely think this can only be the case as long as you stick to your distinctions between mine and thine. I affirm that what you call money is the devil of devils, the tyrant of the French, the source of all evils, the bane of souls, and slaughterhouse of the living. To imagine one can live in the country of money and preserve one's soul is like imagining one can preserve one's life at the bottom of the lake.
Arguments like his had a huge influence on the European Enlightenment. Because of what intellectuals like Pandiaronk was saying, Europeans started to think about egalitarianism and how their inherited hierarchies were not a given. Graeber and Wengrow say that the stages of civilization trope was in fact cooked up by a guy called Turgot in about 1760, precisely as a reaction to this indigenous critique.
And yet it's widely believed that the oldest continuous civilization on Earth is a Stone Age one, and that we're stuck somehow in the hunter-gatherer stage until, lucky for us, modernity arrived on our shores. I mean, look at the trouble that Brice Pascoe and his dark emu got into and caught up in the usual culture wars. But Graeber and Wengrow know exactly what Pascoe was talking about. They say that the strength of evidence in dark emu is overwhelming. Indigenous populations were routinely working, cultivating, and enhancing their territories, and had been for millennia.
Making rational decisions about how they wanted to live, dialoguing, discussing, negotiating towards consensus, perhaps with a different shape to time. Not time as a series of numbers like on the calendar. What an idea.
There's something about Whitefella ways of dreaming that loves to break things up and divide them into components. You see that with Whitefella's mistaking country for a singular nature, for instance, so as to divide it up into resources and boundaries. It all must have something to do with limits, with order. After all, limits are all about mastery. And the same thing happened with time too. Time shamans of the European Enlightenment spelled out a vision for time that was linear, progressive, and moving toward a specific end, speaking about this new time as if it was a law of nature and something that could be harnessed as if by magic. But the biggest trick of all was to deceive people into believing it. The more time could be split up, petitioned, the more control it allowed. Michel Foucault reminds us of this when talking about the control of activity and the making of docile subjects, and adjusting the body to temporal imperatives, meeting targets, being in time, being on time. Time became universalized and was turned into a resource that could be mined and controlled. And then you have colonization. Colonization spelt a rupture in time and place, and life was never the same. Time out of place. Sounds pretty funny. And for blackfellas, time was always connected to country, to dreaming. Country speaks time. So time was always in place. It was always in place. And it was never stripped away or abstracted. Time rose out of country.
That makes me think of biotemporalities. The technical term for this is phenology. Biotemporalities are an antidote to numerical temporalities. One definition of Whitefella dreaming could be naturalism with superimposed numerical metrics. What you were saying about partitioning, grid patterns in time and space. Naturalism, according to anthropologist Philippe Descola, is the European structure of a singular nature coupled with plural cultures. But in totemic or animist systems, Australian cultures are supposed to be totemic. You have nature cultures where everything is alive and we're aware of different living things having their own pace. Everyone, even supposed things, operate on their own time.
Like a fly that lives a lifetime in a day, or a stream that's older than time it's not rushing anywhere. Or times corresponding to one another even. Like knowing that the yams are ready when grasshoppers come out. A shared being and a shared becoming.
Among so-called moderns, we are most aware of biotemporality around talk of women's biological clocks. Biotemporality that the usual masculinist corporate schedules still find it difficult to accommodate. Reproductive biotemporalities are, of course, primary, but that has not stopped machinic organizational temporalities trying to segment and flatten them. Of course, there's nothing clock-like at all about women's reproductive temporalities. A woman might not notice a slight dip in the intensity of her monthly estrogen cycle, but it seems to correspond to an anxiety about writing that next book to improve her tracking towards tenure.
Yeah, she might have an attitude towards a potential partner like, oh, what the hell, they'll do. On a first date, this potential partner is not consciously aware of her pheromones, and instead they think she's actually interested in Dungeons and Dragons and what they've got to say about it. So would you say biotemporalities are heterogeneous assemblages of things like lunar cycles, growth, and chemoreception?
Yeah, great definition. Plus, I think it's in tune with the temporal philosophy of immanence, immanent versus transcendent time. Who could possibly think that a concept as slippery as time could be pinned down with numerical apparatuses like calendars and clocks? If we accept that certain biotemporalities can erupt, exerting their living but haphazard forces, precisely the kind of time that the relentless march of numbers is trying to keep at bay, then are we not in the realm of immanent time? Temporalities that throb beneath the surface or slowly bulge like white mushrooms pushing aside pine needles, or flicker with the silvery flashes like perch in the Bulu River, or a pregnant cow whose belly grows with vegetable slowness for 9 lunar months. All these pulsating lives at their own pace. The time on a transcendent track is telling us to wait for a flip to a higher level, when we've left actual life behind and we've become nothing less than pure disembodied spirit. Transcendence as prophet. The transcendent God, as Deleuze and Brierty put it, is the God who sows and reaps, as opposed to the immanent God who replants and unearths, replanting of offshoots versus sowing of seeds. And they conclude transcendence, a specifically European disease. But speaking of dungeons, people are always captivated by the idea of cicadas spending 7 years as nymphs in a kind of suspended animation in the dark underground, only to suddenly emerge into the sunlight. This is literally transcendence, is it not?
Yeah, they metamorphose into different creatures.
They must think they're in heaven. They fly around on the breezes in the rain and sunshine. They sing at dusk with that continuous screaming noise. Then they have sex. When I was a kid, the varieties used to have names like Cherry Nose, Brown Baker, Red Eye, Green Grocer, Yellow Monday, Whiskey Drinker, Double Drummer, and Black Prince.
You mythologize them.
Of course, that's a way of saying we exchanged power with them.
And they soon die within a couple of months.
You know how you said the time of one thing corresponds to another? Yams are ready when the grasshopper comes out. I've heard similar things. When the black kites are flying over the dunes, the salmon are running. These temporalities are linked up in reckonings that can only be made by humans, right?
I think so.
As opposed to the abstract numerical accounting of things for quantification and marketing, biotemporalities are singularities. And in the case of human reckonings of them, they can collide or intersect to produce meanings and courses of action. Deborah Bird-Rose, in her posthumous book Shimmer, tells us that eucalypts don't flower just for themselves, as it were, but produce their pollen nectar at night, invisible light-coloured flowers, so that the peak of their desirability coincides with the nighttime fly-out of their main pollinators, the flying foxes, leaving the leftovers for the bees and birds to consume during the day. There's something indivisible and unique about both kinds of singularities, say, flying fox and eucalypt blossom. There are events, says Tom Connolly in the Deleuze Dictionary, that make it both unique and common, both an entity of its own perceptual data and a ground for the relation that the monad holds with its environments. So we would like to talk about composed and multiple singularities when it comes to biotemporalities. if the philosophers will allow it. I think I like it that singularities are events creating environments in places where the perception is felt in movement. What have we got on history, Max? Do we have any exhibits on history?
Yeah, over here, we've got this comet one. So an old man in the Kimberley, on being asked when the cattle station was set up, said, same time that the comet fell down, referring to Halley's Comet in 1910. So this is accurate, reliable historical knowledge, but notice without numbers.
The singularities are expressed by those demonstrative pronouns. That comet, that cattle station.
But then there's this exhibit over here. That's a story that's close to home for me. So many of my relatives were brought up or lived on Cherbourg Mission. And for a time, they were also sent to Palm Island as well. After an old grandfather was accused of starting a race riot between the Aboriginal community of Cherbourg and the white community at Mergen. And an uncle tells me that the policeman drew a pistol on my grandfather, and in the end, the grandfather wrestled the pistol away and shot it in the air and stopped the fight. But anyway, both places, Cherbourg and Palm Island, were set up during the early 20th century with the idea of forcing Aboriginal people into a way of living that started to mirror European ways of living. And they called it protection in those days. On paper, these institutions were meant to act like a cicada, buried or kept away from the world, locked away in another world, so as to be transformed day by day, generation by generation, towards a supposedly civilized condition.
The mischief of transcendence is right there, eh? Spelled out in the language of progress.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, protectors spoke of Aboriginal people as being incapable of change without supervision and restraint. And this was all wrapped up in pastoral logics of salvation as well. For ages, lots of whitefellas were saying that it was a law of nature that Aboriginal people would disappear, to make way for whitefella civilization and for progress. But by the time protection rolled around, they started to say things like transforming Aboriginal people into so-called civilized subjects would mean suspending the laws of nature.
So that was their idea of turning Aboriginal people into subjects and objects of history, where history means progress, and progress is as much about destruction as it is about transformation.
Yeah. And they tried to control just about every aspect of Aboriginal people's lives. And time was at the center of everything. So for much of Cherbourg and Palm Island's history under the Protection Acts, they would ring bells throughout the day. A bell telling people when to wake up, when to gather for roll calls, when to go to work, when to take a break, when the day was over, curfew, and on and on.
That bell must have been such a strange metallic sound on an ancient continent, like axes chopping down trees, gunshots, or the clinking of chains, reverberating out over the country and claiming mastery over it.
Absolutely. We have this poem up here by Cecil Fisher to remind us. It says, "We who lived on reserves or missions, the stories we all could tell of the rules and regulations and the fear of the mission bell. It rang morning, noon, and also night. This bell, which was the protector's tool, the bell told to start and finish work. It forced upon us the white man's rule." And Fisher goes on to say that the bell rang 11 times between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. each weekday, and it was replaced years later by a siren. That siren Fisher called the screaming noise from hell. Speaking of, when my family were out on Palm Island, they were placed under the authority of a superintendent named Curry, and he loved the bell. It was all part of trying to turn the whole island into a prison. He even had jail cells in the back of his yard. He would beat the bell day and night, trying to control everything. It was enough to drive people womba or mad. But in the end, he was the one who went mad. When he first came there, people knew him as Uncle Boss. But after a while, people knew him by Mad Dog. He was an insomniac, sleepless, agitated, paranoid, and thought he was godlike with his bell. And one day, the bell-ringing tyrant sent a telegram to the government promising to clean Palm Island up for good. And that night, he went on a rampage, killing other white fellas that had undermined his rule, blowing up his house with a kerosene bomb, and then walking down the main street shooting at houses. And the police took a long time to arrive from the mainland, too long, and an Aboriginal man ended up having to shoot Curry in self-defense.
Gosh, that reminds me of Deleuze and Guattari again, that critique of Goya, that it's not the slumber of reason that engenders monsters, but a vigilant insomnia, rationality. This time, tyrant Mad Dog sounds like just such a monster.
I reckon. And eventually they put up clock towers in places like Palm and Cherbourg. It's funny, Whitefella time, that abstract and unimplaced time, was literally being installed on country into the landscape. And as well as spying over people all day, keeping them in time and on time, the one at Cherbourg looks like an obelisk, as if the clock time there had always, as if clock time there always was and always would be.
When you were growing up, Max, do you remember people asking how old you were all the time?
I'm not sure, maybe. Maybe not.
I'm thinking of someone in a supermarket queue saying to the parent, "Oh, what a lovely little boy. How old is he?" Or "What a lovely little girl."
Oh, yeah, occasionally. But maybe I was too cheeky for nice comments like that.
Because from my experience up in Broome, the local mob never asked those kinds of questions that function to assign numbers. They're more likely to say, in Broome English, "Who belong this one?" Even that might be a bit rude to ask that question in front of the kid. But the answer might be, "E granny for my sister. This is my sister's grandchild." The pronoun "e" is gender neutral, so the response assigns neither age nor gender, those familiar sociological categories that we have to fill out on forms the rest of our lives. But the answer does usefully fit the kid into the kinship system, so that the person asking the question now knows their exact relationship to the child and what practices come with that. It's a simple observation of everyday culture that assigns the child to a kin group rather than to age, developmental psychology, ages and stages, or to gender categories for that matter. Another observation might be the absence of wristwatches and the common evocation of room time as a reason for not expecting anyone to turn up on time for a meeting. Working with old Paddy Rowe, who never had a wristwatch, I noticed he had another gesture for talking about time, a humbling hands gesture, as he said the words generation after generation, to talk of his people's way of living on country from the past to the future. It's a gesture reproducing cyclical kinship. In Aboriginal English, your granny is both your grandparent and your grandchild. The traditional skin names are also cyclical. If your skin name is Banaga, your children will be Garamba, like your mother. Human beings, Paddy Rowe would also say, act to energize the life of the country, which is destined to grow generation after generation, time as engendering, not counting. You remember we were both reading Jonathan Lear's Radical Hope book about the crow in North America.
Yeah, and you ended up calling Paddy Rowe a poet of radical hope because he and his other elders had created a new kind of future.
Because he was worried about the future generations.
Yeah, and apart from being stuck in some prehistory, he was as inventive as any modernist.
What made time palpable for him as opposed to empty and meaningless, which is what was threatened by cultural genocide and assimilation, was the dreaming, or garaga, or the law, and boys ready and willing to go through the law.
I get it. What Pickens' time is culture, not just ceremony, but all the mundane, everyday stuff that goes along with its maintenance.
Exactly. I'm not sure I like the deep time metaphor much. It just extends linearity. Thickness is all about lovely complexities and entanglements.
And Anna Clark is a bit suspect of deep time as well in her review of the new book, Everywhen. She says, I couldn't help but wonder, does the history disciplines reach into Indigenous deep time threaten to colonize a space, which has so far eluded Western epistemology? And she refers to the curly questions, saying, that's not to say all the curly questions are answered or reconciled. Clearly there is a question as to how Australian Indigenous texts, drawn in sand, sung, painted, etched, and walked on country, can be rendered into scholarly historical discourse.
Yeah, these Australian Indigenous texts are multimodal, that is thick, not just a thin line of prose in an academic discipline which has forgotten how to make an event of what they want to achieve.
And this is what happened to Captain Cook in Penny MacDonald's 1989 film, Too Many Captain Cooks. It features Rambanga man, Paddy Warambanga, telling us with great authority, this was not the historical Captain Cook from 200 years ago, but Captain Cook from 1,000,000 years ago, who brought to the Rambanga in Arnhem Land axes, steel, and steel knives. They all come from Captain Cook. It's his song, his story, his painting. Paddy is telling us this as he is recreating the song, the story, and the painting in the film before our eyes. This is the power of the real, multiply real. The multiply real Captain Cook, now with dreaming status because he is multidimensional and immortal. Not at all like the new Captain Cooks who started shooting people down in Sydney. Paddy says, we respect only one Captain Cook. Nobody can change our culture because we have a ceremony from Captain Cook.
But I agree with Anna Clark that it would be worse for history to not try at all. If the current reconciliation push, voice, treaty, truth, ever gets as far as truth, then presumably versions of historical truth will be much in demand. But what other kinds of truth might be important in the Indigenous invader negotiation? How do you deal with the apparent absurdity of the Yolngu Cook being from 1,000,000 years ago?
Well, it's a way of saying that not everything has to pivot around 1770, that moment called sovereignty or the dawn of modern Australia, or the pivot from prehistory to history, as if everything suddenly changed at that point. That is a trivial kind of apprehension of time. Paddy Warambanga has appropriated Cook and thickened him up in his own terms with a song, a story, a painting, and a dance. He made him real.
So when the Yolngu put on impressive performances for visiting dignitaries, the latter are duly impressed, but possibly for the wrong reasons. They think it's culture in a narrow sense, as if real life is happening in some other domain. Well, that was a good little.
Yeah. So what will we do now?
Have we run out of time?
Run out? Like sand through the hourglass, that old technology?
Seek closure.
Recap what we've said.
The critique of the Whitefella gods of reason.
Those monsters of an insomniac rationality.
Of course, there's the well-known stages of civilization, one of the major pieces of Whitefella Mischief.
Worth repeating until it sinks in. I think. Oh, and those hell spells and other technologies of discipline.
And deepness is just another obsession with origins. What thickens time is culture.
And transcendence is more Whitefella Mischief. We prefer immanence.
Biotemporalities and totemic relations as interspecies partnerships.
What do you reckon? Are we there yet?
We're there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Max and Stephen. I'll just fiddle with these screens so I can bring up people up here. Sorry, Max. Don't go.
I want more.
Yeah, we pulled up a bit quickly there.
It's not happening. Stop share. Okay. Mahira, can you set up a speaker mode so someone's speaking just automatically?
Yes.
Okay, any questions, anyone, while I set up? Tom?
Thank you so much to you both. It was illuminating, wonderful as always. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about about the critique or the suggestions you're making about deep time, which I thought were really interesting, and the culture that thickens time instead of just making it deeper. And I guess I was thinking in particular of the way Debbie Rose wrote about multi-species knots of ethical time and talked about time. I think was also interested in thickening time and thinking about knots of ethical time and thinking about organisms and processes and culture in the ways that you're talking about too, working obviously with Yarl and Lingara people, thinking about time as embodied, knotted, thick, I guess. So I'm hoping you can make a connection to Debbie's thinking there in part, but also the reason I ask is because I'm interested in if you could say more about the cultures that thicken time, what that thickening looks like. What does that make sense? And I guess partly because I wonder if the word culture is the right one. I wonder if there are other things that thicken time as well. Or maybe if you can just say more about culture so I get what you mean. Does that make sense?
Got anything to say about
Minute.
yeah, so thanks for referring us to Debbie Rose's, which book is that?
I don't know, it could be interesting. There was an article called
Oh, okay, good. Another example might come from the book we mentioned by Jonathan Lear called Radical Hope. So he's North American, writing about the crow, and the crow had a culture of buffalo hunting, and when the buffalo were killed and basically killed off pretty much, everything that revolved around the hunting of buffalo was no longer possible. And so the telling phrase that an old man called Plenty Coup had at the time was, "Time stopped for us. The hearts of my people fell to the ground and they could not lift them up. We could not continue being crow anymore." And so Lear goes on to interrogate that, and he finds what's the key concept that falls out of the life of the crow people was the concept of courage. And so a lot of stuff around generating courage. And so if you can no longer do the things that make people courageous, especially the men, then what's the point of being crow anymore? And so the parallel with Australia was the like old Paddy Rowe in Broome, that doesn't have a culture revolving around the concept of courage, but around dreaming. That was the significant thing. So sure, you've got to have the ceremonies, but they've got to have a point. They've got to be real. And all the mundane stuff that it goes in the build up to the ceremony is important as the ceremony itself, hence the whole culture. So the same with the crow, they couldn't just go to the shelf and pick up another kind of courage. It had to be the way things were, sort of thing. And even though their lives continued, and they were in fact courageous, it just wasn't working in the same way. So that's what I'm trying to get at with thickness. Whether the culture's the right word, I'm not sure either. Complex of things, including the non-humans like buffalo.
Any other questions in the room or over Zoom? Response? Right, response.
No, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I guess it reminded me of the point you were making about when somebody asks who this child is, and the response is about relationship. So it's the thickening is through relationship. It seemed to me that that's what how you're talking about thickening time is about relationships, which aren't necessarily all between humans, but of course culture is not all between humans either. So yeah, I'm not sure. But I think that Debbie's doing something similar when she talks about multi-species knots of ethical time, that it's about embodied process.
Yeah.
Anyway. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. And to answer Susan's question on Zoom, that the link will be disseminated out via email. If you get in touch with Elspeth or someone will share the link for the recording. Any other questions?
I'd like to ask Stephen a question if I could.
Go for it, Mark.
Stephen, the whole thickening of culture is a really fascinating idea, and I'm wondering whether you're implying as well too that the whole process of Western modernity has been a thinning out of culture, a thinning of the blood, so to speak. And I'm wondering, so when an Indigenous elder says white man got no dreaming, whether that's kind of saying a very similar thing, and whether there's something to look forward to in terms of non-Indigenous culture in Australia, in terms of thickening the culture, what you think that might be, and would it be something in terms of an entanglement with Indigenous in an ethical way after voiced treaty truth?
You know about Old Man Stanner, White Man Got No Dream.
Yeah. Well, we've been writing a little bit about I guess using Whitefella Mischief, we've been trying to recognize different Whitefella dreamings that are there. Like Captain Cook might be one of the ancestral spirits for modern Australia. And things.
In the talk, we sounded a bit like we were being negative about linear and numerical time reckonings of those Whitefella reckonings of time, as if they were thin and inadequate. But in fact, they're probably as complex as any other reckoning of time. It's just that they're made for purpose, right? Segmented time is made for segmented work patterns, or the concept of productivity that Melissa Gregg talked about in the first lecture in this series, all about productivity and Fordism. So it's not like it's necessarily a bad system. It's just that it's made for different purposes, and I guess we have to spell out the relations.
I thank you both. There's so much in that talk, just overwhelming. But yeah, I mean, I'm against or with what Stephen's saying about linear time. I've been thinking about resources like the deep sea mining, for instance, which is trying to find a nodule that grows a centimeter every million years that we could then put to use in electric vehicles. Yeah, and the kind of I've talked about it before, the derangement of scales of these times can't be captured by linear time. You know, because it's something that's happening alongside, if you like. You know, I mean, I was just thinking about North Sea Oil off Aberdeen, and the one of the big Murchison platforms in the very north. It was productive for 34 years, but yeah, the crude was began in one of the scenes that I can never remember, but you know, 200 million years ago, and you know, and it'll take 30 years to decommission the rig. So I mean, it's just these kind of craziness that's going on, that we think that we can solve things in the future, you know. Anyway, what I was also wondering is, can you tell us, those of us who weren't at the CSAA, the beginning of the project, and yeah, and I'd also kind of like to know how you work together, how you write together.
Well, Stephen actually marked my PhD thesis, and then we kind of became pen pals after that.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, Stephen showed me this project of Whitefella Mischief that he'd been working on, and I was kind of playing around with this idea of Whitefella dreaming, and they kind of have this overlap. So, I guess we're interested with Greber and Wengrow, and I can't remember the original. We're really interested in dialogue as a kind of mode of analysis, and we've been trying not to be essentialist subjects. So we might like I write a bit of Stephen's dialogue, he'll write a bit of mine, and kind of I think it works really well.
That's great. Talk about breaking up the linearity of dialogue too, you know, me, then you, then me.
Yes, what you're saying about the North Sea oil, that's one of the reasons we embarked on a critique of Whitefella reason, forms of rationality, because of the kind of absurdity of what kind of rationality it would accelerate the consumption of fossil fuels, in the knowledge that it's future destroying. That's the kind of yeah, that's one of the reasons why we've been bringing forward this critique of Whitefella forms of rationality. Not that we'll be uncritical of blackfella ones either, because both are performing different kinds of magic, as it were, bringing ideas into being and destroying others. So we're if we do concentrate on Whitefella forms of rationality and their critique, if we concentrate more on the Whitefella ones, just because the playing field is not level. Yeah, so that's, I think, but we'll talk about both.
Well, it's certainly that I think it was Max's phrase, but now who knows whether it's Max or Stephen Max, but time was always in place. And I love that formulation for many, many reasons, but also because I get really fed up with the formulation that, you know, we need to save the earth for our grandchildren, you know, which, you you know, seems to me to be one of the most selfish ways of thinking about things. But if time's always in place, the grandchildren will be in place too, if that makes sense.
Thanks so much for the talk. I found it really interesting. I'm always kind of myself thinking about the politics of reason, what counts as rational and what doesn't. And I thought it was interesting that you thought kind of Bruce Pascoe along with Graeber, and I've forgotten the other co-author of The Dawn of Everything's last name, but because I've found that the book Dark Emu kind of interesting in that it, in some sense, the defense that it makes is on a kind of that linear logic of, oh no, these cultures are not hunter-gatherer cultures, they're more advanced, but there's kind of a critique that you could leverage against that very conceptualization of progress, which obviously you do in the presentation. And kind of thinking about I liked the way that you said it, like a complexity on different terms, or like multiple different kinds of complexity, but also what I like is this complexity on shared terms at the same time, kind of by thickening our understanding of culture, you can both like add to rather than merely deconstruct, I suppose, and then you can maybe think about what is kind of, I don't know if consistent, if that's kind of like the urge to find something consistent is itself kind of embroiled in like the desire for mastery or something. But I think, sorry, this is just a series of thoughts, but yeah, I guess maybe you could speak more to the importance of dialogue in your work then, because that seems to me a fundamental element that kind of links together a lot of what I've just said.
I think it goes back to what maybe what Mark was saying before about you know, what could lay beyond the voice treaty truth as well. But I don't know, just recognizing that, like when we're not trying to be essentialist subjects, like recognizing that shared complexity has always been there. Like when Stephen was talking to me about it, he said that, you know, I think he used the analogy of, you know, these explorers going off, but then they kind of not remembering that there was also Aboriginal guides all along the way, and that there's sort of shared connections were always there.
Yeah. So that's one of the reasons for dialogue, is a kind of the most trivial answer is, well, dialogue is about reconciliation or some sort of political program, but that's not our aim. But that's something I think our readers might respond to when we eventually publish, that it's a staged dialogue that is trying to work towards some kinds of solutions. But also it's a generic stylistic thing in that we're trying to avoid the academic monologue, and splitting it across the dialogical position is polyvocal, because then we're also trying to bring out the voices of non-humans as well, with our biotemporalities. We dealt more with the Bruce Pascoe debate in Melbourne at the sort of, you know, chapter 1 of this, the first attempt at this dialogue, and so that brought out a number of other kinds of tricks of rationality that were used by Peter Sutton and Walsh in their critique of Pascoe. But yeah, what you're saying about the stages of civilization argument, this is in Graeber and Wengrow, They bring out lots of examples of why it isn't the case that people will get to the agricultural stage and like humans have got to the next step. In fact, people would sometimes go backwards, or even on a seasonal basis. Early peoples would might have a strict hierarchical social arrangement in the winter months, and then in the summer months they disperse and everything becomes more anarchic, and they're roaming around in small bands. Everybody's egalitarian. Winter comes again and they get hierarchical again. It's not as if egalitarian society or hierarchical society were on stages of human growth, but they were switching all the time. So that same would apply with Aboriginal Australia, that and this would be in Pascoe's work. Even if he's accused of saying Aboriginal people were agriculturalists too, just like you white people, he was actually saying they had a number of techniques for managing resources that they would use at different times and places, again on that seasonal basis.
There's a hand up in Zoom, a bunch of numbers.
They're looking for the Zoom person.
That's me. Sorry, that's my, hi there, that's my staff number. Sorry, I don't know how to change it, but if anyone would like to log into Western Sydney using that number and do all the training courses I haven't completed, go right ahead. I'm Gay Hawkins. So thanks for your thinking, both of you. A beautiful paper, so rich and suggestive and visually provocative. I wanted to ask you a question about the idea of duration, which of course was a really central term in a lot of cultural studies thinking about time a while back. And I wanted to ask you about how you'd see, and of course that's Bergson's sort of process philosophy. I wonder how you'd see that relationship between imminence and duration, and Bergson's argument that of course duration allows you to get a sense of multiple temporalities, that it's definitely a category that he used to disrupt notions of linear time. How useful is that to your thinking?
You thought about duration?
No, I haven't, but I will now.
I think we have to take that as a contribution to this dialogue, because we hadn't really embarked on thinking about Bergson and duration, but it's a track we should go down. And if it's the case that it helps us understand what the hell imminent time might be about, then great. I mean, looking at the bits and pieces of philosophy that was trying to tell me how imminence worked in relation to time, I just got confused because I couldn't. I mean, I know I tried. I think it was me. I tried to link it to biotemporalities and say that is imminent time, and if an insect only lasts a day and an oak tree lasts centuries, their durations are obviously vastly different. I mean, we mentioned the word forces in there, that the imminent time is exerting forces as like a mushroom burgeoning up out of the ground or something. And we're just casting around trying to find concrete explanatory detail. But I think we'll have to take your advice and do some more research on that one. Thanks, Gay.
Thank you.
You can call me 200.
Yeah, so I think you've answered my question, because I was you've added the temporality wing. You know, where's the museum going? I just heard it can be added in duration. What's happening?
Can't hear you, Prue.
Oh, sorry.
So the question is, we having having taken people on the first tour of the museum in Melbourne, we built a temporalities wing for this purpose of this talk today. There was an extra wing on the old tin shed. And now this question is, what's next in the what's the next wing in the museum? Have you had any ideas what to do next?
No, not really.
No, we might just respond to the next commission. We can only write when we're asked to write.
Yeah.
You know, we can't make up things by ourselves. If somebody asks a question, yeah, sure, we'll come up with another wing. I don't know what you're...
By the way, that the museum looks awfully like the building at the back of the mission at Sherbrooke.
Okay.
It isn't, right?
Stephen sent me that photo, so I'm not sure.
I don't know where,
Yeah.
that's an old
Does
sharing
look-
shed. I think.
Yeah, it does. Look familiar. I'll keep an eye out next time.
Can I ask why a museum? I mean, I think personally, from my perspective, my history, reverse engineering, Western memory arts and knowledge in this particular way, I think it's a perfect choice. But in terms of, I guess, going back to the questions about the origins of how this project came together, why the Museum of the Magicians of Reason from both of your perspective?
I could think of an answer which was along the lines of the theme of the Cultural Studies Conference in Melbourne was past and futures, right?
Yep.
So our visit to the museum was in the year 2060.
Mm.
So that was set in the future, but it was looking back onto the past. So that was already a temporal dynamic that was obviously didn't work because I was still alive in 2016. And Max wasn't an old man yet, and so that's how that came about. And yeah,
Yeah, I think we kind of did it for that purpose, like looking at, like treating the present differently in that way, like pretending that we're in the future, we can look back on right now and think, oh, look how people used to think and what tricks they used to play, sort of.
and then it's a little device having exhibits, which we're using slides to illustrate here. But when we write it up, we'll actually just have prose descriptions of the exhibits. So it kind of condenses the image, and we'll do that in writing, not in these images. And you know, a description of the Tin Shed Museum in the year 2060 will take the form of, well, it looks like an old tin shed, but on the inside, it's got walls faintly glowing with veggie mesh that is bioluminescent, keeping the whole interior at a perfect temperature and humidity to preserve the exhibits.
Right.
It's all very 2060 high-tech inside.
Well, it's also interesting that museums are fundamentally about taxonomy, and with Helen Greenwood, who's one of my PhD students, she's been thinking about taxonomy in terms of Jewish taste, and going back to that wonderful quote from Borges that Michel Foucault says, he burst into laughter about the one, what animals look like, and that it shattered the very kind of basis of our thought. So, I mean, with your museum, I think you could be really putting that forward, that these taxonomies that we think are in place and durable and all the rest of it are temporary and can be just changed around.
Yeah, experimental museum exhibits, yeah.
My apologies to the person in Zoom who has left a comment that's a little disjointed. I can't actually see all of it or who posted it. Oh, it's Susan. Sorry, Susan. So Susan says, in terms of deep time and always was and always will be, I believe meaningful existence happens by being continually and respectfully co-created through practice of specific arts, knowledges, relationships, recognitions, and important places, which is thick culture in Susan's view. Was there any sort of response to that comment or?
It's a nice philosophical statement, I think, and picks up on the notion of thickness, which, you know, thickness, which obviously was already in the anthropological notions of thick descriptions, which is, I think, is being referred to there. So, yeah, thick descriptions is something I'd like to endorse as more general practice for cultural studies. And in relation to films of temporality, then well, we talked before about how temporalities can be thought of either in simplistic thin terms or in thicker terms, which involves obviously a more multi-realist descriptive kind of prose, so that what goes into your description is not just the objective real, but also the concepts, the possibilities, the feelings, all of those detail that might get into a really good cultural studies text, whether it's ethnographic or descriptive in another sense. It's like what we used to say about cultural studies, that you know, that a discipline like sociology might describe society, but cultural studies describes society, but with history as well. So that was what excited me about cultural studies early on, was it's not just about describing social spaces, but with a sense of what's happened historically as well.
And I guess I was trying to think, can it happen in Western culture? Because the person who asked, is culture a part of all this, or the right word? But perhaps in a very strong arts experience, or perhaps others, where there's so much alignment with our sense of who we are in life that we actually also lose ourselves in it. It becomes bigger than us, so that's another thickening. So I was just kind of musing and seeing if I could put anything into words.
Thanks for the question.
Any other questions in the room or on Zoom? Yep, got one in the room. Bit of a walk.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm also kind of looking at temporalities and you know, cultures and world building in my thesis, so I found it like really insightful. But I was wondering, so this exercise of thinking about the past from the future, is that like a method that can be replicated, or is it more of a metaphor for, you know, what you guys wanted to write about?
It is a metaphor. It's a trick. It's a trick, but it's, from my point of view, I don't know about Max, but from my point of view, it's this kind of future anxiety. It's like that famous Walter Benjamin image of the angel of progress turning its back. And so now we've got it's like future catastrophe coming back onto the present. And that does something weird to time, obviously. So that's how I'm thinking about that museum set in the year 2060, constructed in the year 2060, It's more of almost an optimistic scenario where quite a few things have changed by 2060, haven't they? For a start, Indigenous sovereignty has been restored. There are no longer any states like New South Wales or Victoria. They're all these bioregions. And if you look up Kulleria country on Google, it talks about the Channel country as a bioregion already. And it's bioregional because of its waterways, right? Yeah. But it's but Indigenous regionality was bioregionality. We talked about that in the previous talk. Freshwater people, saltwater people. The Anjamatna in South Australia are rock people because they're in the hills. So clearly they're linking to their bioregions. And there's a couple of things that have happened in 2060, and we like to think of it, I think we both do, somewhat optimistically about a number of changes that have been made. And we can look back on today as the time when things were changing from bad to slightly better.
Declan, over on Zoom.
Thank you. Fantastic provocations there, gents. Really enjoyed that. Just wanted to draw you out, or I guess invite you to draw out some of the issues around magic that were in the title. I guess Isabel Stengers has had a long-standing engagement with Starhawk and paganism, and I guess for me the obvious parallel was in the flipping of the I guess it's sort of Max's provocation that we're thinking about white person dreaming and thinking, like, questioning that symmetry between Indigenous temporalities and modern temporalities. So I was just wondering if you had any other thoughts on the ways that magic can also help to accomplish that. And I guess it's a way of decentering modern concepts of science in the practices of knowledge as well.
It kind of takes me back to Goya and the Sleep of Reason, and it's that kind of magic that says there is no such thing as magic, which I think that's kind of what we're playing with. Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Declan, for bringing up Isabel Stengers, because clearly her capitalist sorcery book that she wrote with Philippe Mignard, Capitalist Sorcery, subtitle Techniques of Désenvoûtement, Counterspells. Yeah, I think in the English, Counterspells. Clearly that's been a major influence on what we're doing with our forms of Whitefella magic, and then an antidote or a counterspell, which traditionally is provided by critique. It's like if capitalism is putting on a mask of normality, then critique tries to remove the mask. But we're also influenced by Michael Taussig and his book, The Magic of the State. And a lot of the stuff in Taussig is about mimetic magic and sympathetic magic, contagious magic. But so basically, it's all those tricks that have the Whitefella being shorthand for European Enlightenment thinking, have performed to stay ahead of the game in their relations to other peoples.
Any other questions? Still have plenty of time.
If I might, I'm really glad you clarified that, Stephen, about the 2060, because so much of what we read is, I was reading this morning, in 30 years, the Antarctic oscillation, which is what brings up the nutrients from the deep, and the upwellings, which can take 1,000 years. They're saying that in 30 years, it's time there won't be any oxygen in the sea, and all of that will stop, as we will probably stop as well. So I mean, it's good to kind of have a break from that and think about 2060 is where, as you say, Aboriginal sovereignty is in place, and we're living in bioregions, and it's not really optimism, it's just yet again a trick of seeing time in a way.
Well, she's brought us to a halt with some serious realism there.
What's that?
We were giving a speculative dialogical paper. And unfortunately, you've brought us to a halt there with some scientific detail about what's going to happen to the
it's everywhere, Stephen. You can't open, and it's also interesting to think, as I was, hopefully Max will be a happy man in 2060, and you and I, Stephen, will be long gone.
Don't say that.
But you don't like the idea of living that long.
Thanks, both of you, for such an interesting presentation and a great discussion as well. This is only kind of a half-formed question, but I'm really interested in what you said about this like metaphor or method of going into the future to look back as a kind of future anxiety or something that brings up a bit of anxiety. And I wonder if you've thought a bit more about how anxiety changes the temporality of the present, like whether it creates a different atmosphere of urgency or just a different type of speed, and what that might mean like for politics or something like that. I don't know, because I think about that a lot, but I'm not sure if I've really articulated that well yet.
Very good. That's something I'll have to think about a bit more.
I'm sure we're, like Max is half my age, less than half my age, and our temporal perceptions at different stages of life are, I'm sure, quite different. And maybe it's something we could work into our writing at some stage. There is an anxiety about end of life scenarios. Person, you think about it a lot more, obviously, and it influences your thinking. You start saying things like, "The last time I." So, and maybe the days are flicking by faster. I don't know.
Yeah, it'd be good to explore that a bit more.
Any other questions? Still got over 10 minutes.
Or that means you can have another drink.
I was just thinking that, Elspeth. So if there aren't any other questions, can we get a round of applause for our two presenters today? And for those of us who are here in person, we will relocate to the courtyard bar for social drinks. And if you don't know where that is, I'll wait around to lead people there. But otherwise, yeah, thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, and thank you again, Max and Stephen. That was really, really rich. And
Thanks for coming
Yeah.
online, people.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm so out of breath.